Close your eyes and imagine a castle at midnight in the dead of winter. The walls groan softly, the wind slips through arrow slits like knives, and the moonlight spills thin and pale over a courtyard buried in frost. Now sink lower, down into the belly of that fortress, beneath the flags and feasts, beneath the echo of boots in the hall, until you reach the dungeon. There, the air itself feels old, cold enough to taste, wet enough to cling to your lungs. This is where men slept when the world had forgotten their names. There were no soft beds waiting for them, no comfort in stone meant to defend kingdoms, not cradle souls. What lay beneath those castles wasn't just darkness. It was purpose-built despair, carved and damp and merciless. And yet, this was where countless human beings spent their nights, thieves, traitors, heretics, beggars, widows accused of witchcraft, soldiers who'd lost the wrong battle. They all lay down in the same shadow, trying to sleep against the cold, knowing that the stone beneath them didn't care whether they woke again. So tonight, let's descend together, slowly, carefully, into that forgotten world. Let's see what it meant to sleep in a medieval prison, when warmth was a memory and hope was thinner than the straw under your head. When a man first entered a castle dungeon, the cold met him before the darkness did. It wasn't the kind of chill that brushed your skin. It bit straight through it. The moment the iron door closed, the air changed, moisture clung to your breath, and the faint torchlight flickered over stone so slick with damp that it gleamed like ice. You didn't step into that place. You fell into it, swallowed whole by silence and rot. Guards rarely spoke. One shove, maybe a muttered curse, and then the sound of the key, heavy, deliberate, turning in the lock. That sound, historians say, was the true beginning of imprisonment. After it faded, what remained was the endless whisper of dripping water, and the slow realization that nothing in this room was meant for comfort. The floor? Stone, uneven and hard enough to bruise your spine in minutes. The air, heavy with mildew and the faint sweetness of decay. If you were lucky, there might be straw scattered in a dark corner, though straw was too generous a word. It was more often rotted hay, damp and alive with fleas, reused from the cell before you. Men lay down upon it not for warmth, but because lying down was the only way to make their chains stop cutting into their ankles. And yet, this straw was a kind of treasure. Many prisoners recorded that even a handful could mean the difference between sleep and madness. The Tower of London, the Château d'Angers in France, the dungeons of Craigive, all kept minimal records of bedding, often noting that straw was issued only when a jailer took pity, or when the smell of filth became too strong to ignore. It was easier to burn the hay than scrub the floor. Those who received none at all learned to curl directly upon the stone. They'd pull their cloaks around their bodies if they still had them, tucking their faces into the fabric to trap what little heat their breath could make. The stone beneath them drank that warmth greedily, leaving skin red, then pale, then numb. It is as though the floor itself breathes cold, wrote one chronicler in the late 13th century, describing a cell beneath Dover Castle. It drinks the heat from the living until the living resemble the dead. In those first hours, prisoners learned what centuries of stone could do. It took your warmth, your comfort, your smell, your noise, until you matched it. Still, silent, cold. But the body is stubborn. It adapts even to stone. After enough nights, you began to move differently, to curl in tighter, to fold your arms and legs into a posture the mind of a free man could not imagine. You learned to sleep in fragments, a minute here, a few breaths there, waking each time a rat brushed past or a drop of water struck your forehead from above. No one truly slept in these prisons. They endured unconsciousness in doses. And in the morning, when the guards came with stale bread or a bucket of water, the straw would cling to your back, frozen stiff as bark. You'd peel it away like a second skin. Historians still debate whether this was deliberate cruelty or simply the byproduct of architecture. Some say the chill was incidental, the natural cost of building walls so thick they could stop an army. Others argue it was intentional, a slow, invisible punishment that left no mark but wore a man down faster than any whip. Either way, as the centuries passed, the chill became a tradition, a language of fear that every captive understood the moment the iron door shut, and so they slept, if you can call it that, wrapped in rags, curled like unborn children, dreaming of heat that never came. In these chambers, warmth was not a right, it was a memory. As the nights dragged on, the body began to learn what the mind refused to accept, that survival depended not on strength, but on adaptation. The first lesson came from the straw itself. It was a living thing, not dead material. It breathed, it shifted, it crawled. Every handful hid an ecosystem of fleas, lice, and tiny black beetles that fed on whatever warmth and skin a prisoner could offer. In some chronicles from France and Bohemia, captives joked that these creatures were their most loyal companions, never leaving, never forgetting to wake them in the middle of the night. One anonymous scribe from Rouen recorded that a prisoner named his fleas as neighbors, for they would not desert him even in death. When you lay on that straw, it wasn't softness you felt first. It was movement, a faint rustling under your ribs, a tickle along your neck, 1,000 small reminders that the dungeon never slept alone. You scratched until your skin burned, but the bites only multiplied. The air smelled of ammonia, sweat, and rot. It clung to the lungs until every breath tasted stale. And yet, amid that filth, you still learned to rest, not because comfort existed, but because exhaustion left no other choice. Those lucky enough to have chains long enough to move could shift their bodies from side to side through the night, keeping blood from freezing in their limbs. Others had no such mercy. Some dungeons, like the infamous cells beneath the Tower of London or Germany's Plassenburg fortress, forced men to sleep while shackled flat to the floor, their wrists and ankles fixed by short iron links. They could not even curl up for warmth. Iron ate into their skin, rubbed it raw, and when frost crept in through the arrow slits, the metal itself grew white and bit like fire. The sound of chains was never absent. It was the dungeon's heartbeat, a slow, irregular clink that echoed down the corridors like an unending prayer. To new prisoners it was unbearable. To those who'd been there for months it became music, a rhythm by which they measured the dark. And yet, even iron has its strange mercies. When night fell deepest, when breath began to fog and shivers grew too violent to control, men began to move closer together, dragging chains, crawling through filth, until bodies met. At first out of instinct, later out of need, human warmth was the only fire allowed in those cells. Prisoners who might have hated each other by daylight learned to lie back to back, shoulder to shoulder, their heat pooling weakly in the narrow space between them. Chroniclers describe this strange intimacy without judgment. In the prisons of Paris, entire families were sometimes locked together, fathers, sons, and strangers pressed into one breathing knot beneath the frost. In the English records of Newgate, guards referred to these human piles mockingly as pig heaps, but those who survived them knew they were lifeboats. The warmth of another body, even a despised one, was worth more than prayer. You can almost see it now, the cell alive with quiet motion in the dark. Men shuffling closer, wrapping torn cloaks around one another, coughing, muttering curses that end in sighs. The smell of unwashed bodies thickens, but it is a familiar smell, almost comforting. When frost crept in, the prisoners became a single organism, breathing, shivering, sleeping in shifts like wolves in a den. There are small details preserved in records that pierce the imagination. How prisoners would time their sleep so that one man remained half awake to push the others closer when someone drifted too far from the group's heat. How even in filth they formed quiet rules: no speaking after midnight, no fighting near the corner where warmth gathered thickest, no kicking another man's cloak. The cold demanded cooperation, and the dungeon's cruelty created a kind of fellowship born of despair. Sometimes this closeness blurred into tenderness, a hand placed over another's shoulder, a whisper meant to steady someone trembling through a fever. These gestures were rarely spoken of in the light, but they existed, fragments of kindness surviving like embers in the ash. And yet, not every night brought that fragile warmth. Overcrowded prisons meant disease spread faster than heat. The fleas that fed on one man's blood carried sickness to the next. Fevers swept through the dungeons like unseen winds, and those who pressed closest together for warmth often perished together too. Historians still argue whether this practice of bodies huddled in unison saved more lives than it took. Perhaps both are true. The dungeon was never simple. Nothing in it was purely mercy or purely malice. Everything blended into survival's grey twilight. Still, when dawn crept through the arrow slits, that thin grey light falling across motionless bodies and shivering survivors, those who woke in each other's arms knew that warmth, however foul, had kept them one day longer in the realm of the living. Long before a man went blind from darkness or numb from cold, the first thing that truly broke him was the smell. It wasn't something that arrived suddenly. It was always there, waiting, as constant as the stone itself. A thick, invisible weight that clung to your clothes, your hair, even your dreams. If the cold punished your body, the stench punished your mind. Every dungeon had its own perfume, a blend of mildew, rot, rust, and sweat, but with time all merged into the same unbearable air. The stones themselves seemed to exhale it, damp with centuries of misery. You could taste it before you spoke, and it lingered on your tongue like something rotten that refused to be swallowed. There was the sharp tang of iron from the chains, the sour musk of straw long past its use, and underneath it all, a darker layer, the unmistakable scent of death that had soaked into the floor. Chroniclers from the 13th and 14th centuries wrote of visitors who fainted before reaching the lowest cells. A French priest who once entered the dungeons beneath Chateau Galliard claimed that the air itself was heavy with souls. Even guards, accustomed to the filth, would cover their mouths with cloth soaked in vinegar before stepping inside. The prisoners had no such luxury. Their lungs became the filters, their bodies the sponges that absorbed the dungeon's breath until they themselves smelled like the walls. In the smaller castles there were no drains, no sewage pits, no running water. Only buckets, sometimes shared among a dozen men, emptied rarely if ever. When those overflowed, waste mingled with the straw, sinking into the cracks between stones where it fermented through the night. The air grew thick, sweet, and foul. Flies bred in the corners, their buzzing filling the silence like a chorus of tiny bells. For the men trapped there, breathing was an act of will. You learned to take shallow breaths through your mouth, avoiding the nose. Some pressed rags to their faces, though most rags were just as filthy. Others chewed on bits of straw, tricking themselves into believing the taste was cleaner than the air. There are even accounts, grim but believable, of prisoners lighting scraps of cloth on fire, hoping the smoke would cover the smell. The fires burned quickly, the smoke suffocating, but for a few moments the stench would shift from decay to burning, from rot to ash, and that change itself felt like mercy. But the smell did more than offend. It infected. The same air that choked the lungs also carried disease. Fever crept silently through those chambers, carried by the damp and the fleas. It came as coughs that turned to wheezing, sores that would not heal, eyes that clouded with infection. In records from Florence and York, entire cells were found dead at once, not executed, not starved, simply overwhelmed by the invisible poison of their own air. The stench was not an accident. Some historians argue it was a tool. There are reports of jailers laughing, saying the smell alone would break the proud faster than chains. They called it the scent of justice. Whether the cruelty was intentional or not, it worked. A man who cannot escape his own breath is already halfway broken. Yet, even here, the human mind performed small miracles of denial. Prisoners grew used to it. What once made them gag became background noise to their senses. Their brains rewired themselves to survive. And when the rare breeze came, A draught through a crack, a whisper of outside air. It could move men to tears. That brief sweetness, that reminder of grass and rain, felt almost divine. But those moments were rare. Most nights the air sat still, pressing down with its heavy hand. You could hear it, feel it, almost see it, like a fog thick enough to touch. And when death finally came to someone in your cell, it didn't arrive as silence or peace. It arrived as another layer of smell, at first faint, then undeniable. Guards often waited days before removing bodies, either from laziness or as an example to the rest. The corpse beside you grew cold, then swollen, and the air grew thicker still. There was no escape from the scent. You could close your eyes against darkness, cover your ears against screams, but you could never stop breathing. You could never turn your lungs away from the dungeon's breath. And in that simple fact lay one of the cruelest truths of the Middle Ages. Even your own breathing was not yours anymore. The dungeon owned it. The air itself had become a weapon. So you learned to endure, to inhale decay and call it life, to sleep with the smell of death under your nose, convincing yourself it belonged to someone else. Until one night, when your chest rose slower, your body colder, and you joined the same air that had tormented you for so long, the dungeon did not change. It merely welcomed another scent to its collection. By the third or fourth night, hunger begins to sound louder than the chains. It creeps into every noise. The dripping water, the rustling straw, the low breathing of your cellmates, until it becomes a kind of music, an endless gnawing rhythm beneath the ribs. In the beginning, you try to ignore it. You tell yourself that morning will bring bread, but morning in a dungeon is a cruel thing. It brings light. Yes, but never food. Most prisoners in medieval castles received their rations not from kings or officials, but from whoever pitied them above. Families sent crusts. Monks brought buckets of thin gruel when charity required it. And when no one came, when names were forgotten and debts unpaid, the guards simply didn't bother. Bread was for the living. The dungeon was for the already half-dead. Chroniclers in London and Paris wrote of cells where prisoners chewed the leather of their shoes or gnawed on straw until their gums bled, just to quiet the ache. Some scraped mould from the walls and ate it, believing that if it grew on stone it must contain something alive. Others caught the rats. That, at least, was real meat, small, sinewy, and dangerous to catch. You could hear them at night, the tiny feet skittering over the floor, claws tapping against iron. They owned the darkness more than the prisoners did. The rats were not afraid of humans anymore. Why would they be? The dungeon was their kingdom. They lived on scraps of bread thrown to the floor, on corpses left too long unburied, on anything that still carried warmth. And sometimes that warmth was sleeping flesh. There are accounts, too many to dismiss, of men waking to find blood on their fingers or their ears half bitten. The creatures didn't wait for death to claim their share. Yet there was another kind of story too, stranger, softer. A tale from Lubeck speaks of a man who fed the rats crumbs of his own bread so that they would leave him unbitten while he slept. Over weeks they grew tame, curling near his legs for warmth. When he died, the jailer found his body surrounded by the animals as if keeping vigil. Maybe it's myth, maybe not, but it shows what desperation could do to a man, teach him to find comfort in vermin. You feel it now, that same perverse companionship. The rats move with purpose, their tiny eyes catching the torchlight. You watch them without anger. They are survivors, like you, bound to the same walls, fed by the same misery. You wonder if they even know the difference between your body and theirs. Hunger doesn't just hollow the stomach, it hollows the mind. You start to dream of food even while awake, of warm bread with crisp crusts, of broth that smells of garlic and thyme, of roasted meat dripping fat. You can almost taste the salt on your tongue, but when you open your eyes you see only the straw, the damp walls and the dark shapes moving in the corners. The mind begins to play cruel tricks. Your fellow prisoner's cough sounds like a pot boiling, the drip of water like fat sizzling on a pan. In some prisons, guards mocked the captives by eating near their cells, letting the smell of hot stew or wine drift down through cracks in the ceiling. The scent became torture in itself, invisible, intimate, and cruelly familiar. They feasted above us, wrote one chronicler from a Parisian debtor's jail, and the scent of meat was the devil's way of reminding us what warmth meant. When starvation deepened, warmth became an illusion too. The body, deprived of fuel, began to shiver less, fingers stiffened, lips turned blue, and the heart slowed. For a moment you might think the cold had eased, but it was only your body giving up the fight. Death by hunger and death by frost often looked the same, quiet curled shapes in the corner, eyes open, mouths slightly parted, as if waiting for food that never came. Historians still argue about whether such starvation was deliberate punishment or simple neglect. Some claim that thin rations were part of the design, a way to break prisoners faster and keep the expense low. Others suggest it was chaos, too many bodies, too few resources, and no one caring enough to change it. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Hunger became another warden, silent and precise, working night and day. And then there was the mockery of warmth. A single scrap of fabric, a rag that passed for a blanket, tossed into the cell when a prisoner was near death. At first it felt like salvation. You'd press it to your chest, desperate for comfort. But soon you'd realize it was damp, stinking, and colder than air itself. It trapped moisture instead of heat, turning your own breath into frost. Yet, you clung to it anyway, because in a dungeon the mind cannot let go of hope, no matter how thin. One prisoner from Florence, a debtor, once wrote that he wrapped himself in a dead man's coat and found it still warm. It was the first mercy I had known in 3 months, he said, and I wept for it. The coat belonged to a thief who had died of fever 2 nights earlier. That was what warmth meant in the Middle Ages, borrowed, fleeting, and purchased from the dead. So, you close your eyes and pull your rag tighter. The rats shuffle near your feet, the smell thickens, and hunger gnaws like a second heartbeat. But for a few moments, your mind drifts to a simpler image, a hearth, a loaf of bread, a cup of wine. The body may be chained, the air may be foul, but memory still burns like a candle in the dark. And in that fragile flicker lies the cruelest comfort of all, the thought that warmth still exists somewhere, even if it no longer belongs to you. Night inside a medieval dungeon was not quiet. To imagine silence down there would be to misunderstand the very nature of suffering. The dark did not mute life. It magnified it. Every whisper became a scream, every sigh a confession. Sound was the only thing that proved the world still existed beyond the stone, a cruel, echoing reminder that others suffered beside you, unseen but never unheard. It began with the chains. They had a voice of their own, a dull, metallic rhythm that pulsed through the night like a heartbeat buried beneath the earth. Some were long enough to scrape the floor when a man turned over in his sleep. Others clinked against the wall every time he breathed. The noise travelled through corridors, bouncing between arches until no one knew which link belonged to which prisoner. The result was a constant metallic murmur, the dungeon's lullaby, irregular and maddening. And then came the coughing, sharp, wet, endless. It punctuated the darkness like thunder, echoing from cell to cell, each fit answered by another until the air itself seemed to shudder. Between those coughs were the sounds of scratching nails against stone, rats against straw, the restless fingers of men carving crosses or words they'd never finish. Some nights you could hear voices praying, not the clear, measured prayers of a chapel, but fractured mutterings, the kind whispered by men who no longer remembered the full words. Fragments of Latin drifted through the air, Misera me Deus, followed by long pauses and quiet sobbing. Sometimes the prayer turned into laughter, brittle and broken. The boundary between faith and madness was thin in places like this. A chronicler from the prisons beneath Bologna once wrote that the darkness itself speaks. He meant that after enough nights you began to hear things that weren't there, footsteps that never came, whispers with no mouths behind them, your own name breathed back to you by the damp stone. Many prisoners described this sensation, a strange haunting that came not from ghosts, but from their own unravelling minds. The dungeon was built not only to hold the body, but to echo the thoughts inside it until they sounded like other people. Still, not every sound was born of fear. Some were attempts at rebellion. Men sang, weakly, hoarsely, but they sang simple melodies, tavern tunes remembered from a freer life, lullabies from childhood, hymns half forgotten. The voices wavered, cracked, sometimes drowned by coughs or sobs, but they continued. Even the guards, hardened by routine, rarely silenced those songs. Perhaps they knew that allowing a man to sing was safer than letting him scream. But screams came all the same. The most terrible were not those of pain but of despair. Long, slow cries that didn't rise or fall, that just stayed vibrating through the corridors like a single unbroken note. The kind of sound that didn't belong to a person anymore but to the stone itself. Sometimes it came from a cell beside you, sometimes from somewhere deeper, so far down that it seemed to rise from the foundations of the castle. You could tell by the pitch whether it belonged to a man or a woman, to youth or age, but not whether it was prayer or madness. And then there were the tortures. Not every night, not in every castle, but often enough to make the others wait for it. That sudden change in the air when silence fractured, the sharp intake of breath, the crack of wood, the first cry that spiraled upward and multiplied in the arches. Prisoners would lie still, listening, not daring to move. The screams became a kind of clock, each one told time by agony. 1 lash, 2 turns of the rack, 3 broken fingers, 4 confessions forced from throats already bleeding. When it ended, when silence returned, it felt worse than the noise, because you knew that the next cry might come from closer. Historians still debate whether the tortures were frequent or rare. Some argue they were reserved for interrogation. Others insist they were constant entertainment for guards bored by long winter nights. But to the men chained in darkness, it didn't matter. A single scream, heard once, could live forever in memory. Over the years, the very architecture learned to echo this human noise. The round vaults amplified everything, turning moans into choirs. The walls absorbed centuries of suffering until it seemed that if you pressed your ear to the stone, you could still hear them, faintly, like a sea trapped beneath the earth. When archaeologists walk those ruins today, they say the acoustics are remarkable, but they do not speak of what the echoes once carried. For those who lived inside them, sound became both companion and tormentor. You could not stop hearing. The cough beside you reminded you that someone still lived. The silence after reminded you that someone didn't. You began to measure time by the rhythm of agony, the rattle of chains, the water dripping, the whisper of fevered prayers. And in that music of misery, men found strange forms of endurance. A prisoner would hum along with another's cough, or tap a rhythm against the wall with a piece of stone. It was pointless, yes, but it made the night feel less infinite. We played the walls like drums, wrote one captive in a 15th century ledger, and though our music was madness, it kept the silence from eating us whole. You can almost hear it now, 1,000 faint sounds blending together, the clink of metal, the cough of sickness, the scratching of straw, the groan of wood, the breath of men dreaming of firelight, and somewhere beneath it all, a low murmur, the dungeon's own voice, repeating what every prisoner eventually learned to whisper before sleep: endure, endure, endure. Not every prisoner in a medieval castle slept on stone. That is one of the cruelest truths of all, that even misery obeyed rank. The same fortress that held peasants chained to damp floors also kept nobles in chambers warmed by fire. The difference was not law or mercy. It was birth. Even beneath the earth, hierarchy endured like a second set of shackles. If you were a common thief, your bed was straw, or less than straw, rotted hay that stank of mildew and urine, crawling with life you didn't want to see. If you were a debt-ridden farmer, a beggar caught stealing bread, a woman accused of witchcraft or gossip. You lay in the dark, pressed against the wall, your body folded around your hunger. But if you were of noble blood, a knight captured in battle, a baron accused of treason, a diplomat taken for ransom, the cell looked very different. Chroniclers who visited such prisoners describe rooms that would have seemed like palaces to the men below. Stone still surrounded them. Yes, but it was carved smooth and hung with faded tapestries. A fireplace burned, tended by servants who knew better than to look their masters in the eye. There was a bed, a real bed, stuffed with feathers or wool, covered with rough linen that still carried the faint scent of soap. Wine was watered down, but it was still wine. The bread was coarse, but it came daily, and when the torches burned low, the prisoner could pull a blanket over his shoulders and feel for a moment almost human. In one French record from the 14th century, a captured knight complained that his captors served wine unfit for a gentleman, and that the fire was seldom tended after vespers. His words were written carefully into a ledger, as though his discomfort were a matter of state. In the same castle on the same winter night, common thieves froze to death in the dungeon below. No one wrote their names. The contrast was not hidden. It was deliberate. Prison itself was never meant to be fair. It was an extension of the world above, where wealth determined how one lived, and also how one suffered. Ransom, after all, required the prisoner to survive. A dead noble was useless, so comfort became calculation. Warmth was an investment, straw an expense spared for the nameless. And yet, even privilege had its own quiet cruelty. The noble prisoner, alone in his furnished chamber, often heard the echoes of the others through the floor. The clinking of chains, the coughing, the cries. The fire in his hearth could not drown those sounds. The comfort turned to guilt, the warmth to torment. A few wrote of this strange inversion, describing their own ease as a heavier burden than cold. "I was warm," wrote one Italian count held in Venice, "but each cry from below chilled my heart more than any frost." Still, for most, comfort dulled conscience. They slept in feather beds while peasants froze a few meters beneath their feet. They awoke to bread and broth while others gnawed wood. The architecture itself enforced this order. Dungeons below, chambers above, the hierarchy carved literally into stone. To ascend a stairway in captivity was to rise not only toward light, but toward privilege. Modern historians argue over how common these luxury imprisonments were. Some believe they were rare exceptions reserved for high-born hostages or political figures. Others claim they were surprisingly frequent, part of the machinery of feudal diplomacy. Whatever the frequency, the contrast stands out in every surviving record. 2 prisons in one body of stone, one for endurance, the other for waiting. In one strange case from Burgundy, a noble accused of treason shared his castle with his own men imprisoned below him. He sent scraps of his meal through the grates, crusts, bones, fruit rinds, not out of pity, but to quiet their moaning so he could sleep. The gesture was both charity and cruelty, a reminder that even mercy was a transaction. Above, the fire cracked below, men froze to death against the same wall, and in that difference, in those few meters of stone separating warmth from cold, lay the purest expression of the medieval world's order. But comfort, even when given, carried its own kind of rot. The nobleman's bed could not free him from fear, only disguise it in linen. The blanket smelled faintly of smoke. The wine turned sour in the cup, and the walls whispered with draughts that smelled of the dungeon below. He might live longer, but he slept no better. The knowledge of inequality gnawed as steadily as hunger, and perhaps that was the final irony, that the poorest prisoner died cold but dreamt of fire, while the richest lay by the hearth and dreamt of freedom. In the end, both suffered the same sleeplessness, the same echoing dark. The only difference was the texture of their blankets. It always began with a cough, a small one at first, dry, uncertain, easily ignored. But in a dungeon, even the smallest sound became prophecy. A cough was not just a symptom, it was an announcement. It meant that the body, already exhausted by cold and hunger, had begun to surrender, and once the cough started, it rarely stopped. The air in those cells was a breeding ground for illness. Thick with damp, never stirred by wind, it clung to the lungs like a second skin. You could see your breath hanging in front of you in winter, a ghost of warmth that died as soon as it left your lips. The moisture carried everything: mildew, the rot of straw, the exhalations of dozens of unwashed bodies, and the invisible seeds of fever drifted in that heavy air, settling in throats and chests. Physicians of the time rarely entered prisons. They said the air was cursed. Some monasteries sent brothers to deliver herbs through the door, rosemary for strength, sage for the lungs, but the smell of mold drowned even the scent of mercy. Without medicine, the prisoners turned to instinct. They pressed rags to their foreheads, soaked them in water that was more brown than clear. They huddled closer for heat, though they knew that the same breath that warmed them also carried sickness. Within days, fever became the dungeon's other light, a flickering, invisible fire that glowed behind the eyes. The skin burned, the lips cracked, and every shiver shook the straw like a storm. The body became its own furnace, fighting against the cold and losing on both fronts. Those who fell ill stopped speaking. Their breath came in short, wet gasps, and when the coughing began to draw blood, the others turned their faces away, not out of cruelty but of fear. In a place where every cough echoed, it was impossible to tell where sickness ended and dying began. Chroniclers from English jails wrote of winter fevers that swept through entire cells in a single week. Men would fall asleep beside one another and wake beside corpses, the dead still warm from the heat of their own illness. The guards, reluctant to enter, left bodies where they lay until the stench forced their removal. Disease, like cold, became part of the architecture. No one truly knew what these fevers were. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, plague, typhus. They had no names for them, only patterns. The trembling, the blood, the silence that followed. The monks who recorded deaths called them visitations, as if the illnesses themselves were ghosts passing through the corridors, touching one body after another, before disappearing into the dark. A prisoner with fever often saw things the healthy could not. The line between dream and delirium blurred. The flicker of a torch became a face. The sound of dripping water became a whisper. Some said they saw angels kneeling in the corners of their cells. Others swore they saw rats standing upright, watching them with human eyes. Fever broke the boundaries of the dungeon, if only in the mind. And yet, even in sickness, the routines continued. The guards still brought stale bread, still dragged chains, still counted the living. The world above moved on, unaware that beneath its floors men were dissolving into shadows. One monk wrote of visiting a dungeon near Avignon where each man's breath was another man's death. He claimed he could feel the air moving like a slow tide, carrying life and disease back and forth with each exhale. No one spoke of healing. The idea of recovery hardly existed here. Illness was simply another stage of imprisonment, a quieter one. The fevered lay still while the others whispered over them, sometimes reciting prayers, sometimes arguing in hushed tones about who would take their straw when they were gone. Death was not an event in these places. It was a constant, an atmosphere, as familiar as the dripping water and the scrape of chains. Historians still argue about the mortality rates of medieval prisons. Some say most captives lasted only weeks. Others insist the strongest survived months, even years, adapting to filth the way a rat adapts to poison. The truth, perhaps, is that time moved differently there. Each night stretched into eternity, and so death, when it came, felt less like an ending, and more like the completion of a long, slow surrender. And when the fever finally took someone, it did so quietly. No cries, no dramatics, just a sigh, a stillness, and then another smell added to the air. The others turned away, closed their eyes, and pretended to sleep. The guards would come in the morning, or not. The dungeon absorbed the body, as it had so many before, leaving only the memory of its heat. Somewhere above, a noble prisoner might cough once, pull his blanket tighter, and drift back to sleep beside his fire. Below, in the endless dark, another voice fell silent, and the stone, indifferent as ever, remembered everything. Not every prisoner who lay upon the cold stones was a man. History remembers the warriors, the thieves, the traitors, but the dungeons themselves remember more than that. They remember smaller hands, softer voices, the weight of tears that no one recorded. They remember the women and the children who entered the dark and never returned to daylight. In the oldest prisons, beneath castles like Warwick, York, and Chillon, the lines between justice and cruelty were blurred beyond recognition. When a man was arrested, his family often followed by default, either as hostages, witnesses, or simply collateral damage. There was no mercy for those bound to the condemned. Women accused of heresy or witchcraft, daughters of rebels, widows who could not pay taxes, all found themselves locked behind iron without trial. Children came with them, clutching their mothers' skirts as the doors closed. The records are sparse, but the silence speaks more loudly than words. In one 14th century ledger from Rouen, a single note appears beside a prisoner's name. His wife and 2 children share his straw. Nothing else. No ages, no description. Only the implication that innocence was chained to guilt because the world above no longer cared to distinguish between them. For women, the dungeon was a cruelty of a different kind. The cold struck just as hard, but shame cut deeper. In those narrow spaces, privacy did not exist. The air saw everything. The stone remembered everything. Many covered their faces with rags, not from warmth but from humiliation. They slept curled tightly, their hair tangled with straw, their clothes stiff with filth. When they cried, the sound was small and dry, the kind that doesn't travel far. There are accounts, faint, fragmented, of mothers singing to their children in the dark, songs without melody, barely more than whispers. One monk from Lubeck wrote that he once passed a cell and heard a woman humming to a babe that could not have been alive. Whether that was mercy or madness, he never knew. The song continued long after the crying had stopped. The children, when they still lived, played with whatever they could find: a bit of wood, a rat's tail, a piece of straw twisted into shape. They laughed sometimes, a strange, bright sound that startled the others. The laughter would echo up through the grates, into the corridors where guards would stop and listen, confused, almost moved. But the laughter always ended the same way, in coughing or silence, or the heavy sound of sleep that wasn't sleep at all. No one wrote stories about those children. Their names were not carved in stone. They existed between lines, between punishments, between centuries, but the walls kept them. Archaeologists sometimes find tiny bones mixed in with the rubble, or fragments of fabric too small for an adult to have worn. They rarely say it aloud, but they know what that means. The dungeon was not only a place of punishment, it was a graveyard for the forgotten. For women accused of witchcraft, the cell was often the prelude to fire. They spent their last nights not in prayer but in feverish waiting, for the dawn, for the guards, for the pyre. Some scratched symbols into the walls, marks that still survive under centuries of soot, spirals, crosses, circles, the desperate geometry of people trying to speak one last time to heaven. Others simply fell silent. They sat with their backs to the wall, staring into the dark, their breath forming small clouds before their faces. One chronicler wrote of a woman in Avignon who refused to move for 3 days, whispering only, "The cold keeps me clean." When the guards came for her, she was already gone. The children of such women often vanished too, absorbed by the stone, lost in the paperwork of centuries. Their deaths were too small to record, their bodies too fragile to bury. The dungeon swallowed them the way the winter swallows light. And yet, sometimes, even in that despair, small mercies occurred. A guard might slip a child a crust of bread. A monk might whisper a blessing through the bars. A dying woman might be allowed to hold her child one last time before the chains were fastened again. History does not record these gestures, but the imagination clings to them, because without them the story would be unbearable. So when you imagine those dungeons, do not think only of grown men in chains. Think of the lullabies that never reach their end, of small hands curled around a mother's arm, of whispers that turned into silence. The castles above may have fallen, their stones scattered by time, but beneath them the air still remembers the sound of children breathing in the dark, and the strange, soft quiet that followed. After enough nights, the mind begins to do strange things. The darkness, once something outside of you, starts to move inward. It fills the thoughts, the dreams, the pauses between breaths. The prisoner stops asking when he will be freed. He begins to wonder instead whether the world beyond still exists. Time no longer passes. It folds. Each night feels like the same night, stretched thin and trembling like a spider's web. At first, hope comes as resistance. Fierce, desperate, almost violent. Men pray loudly, pace their cells, argue with invisible judges. They promise, they beg, they invent bargains with heaven. But when no answer comes, that hope changes shape. It becomes smaller, quieter, and more fragile, like a candle burning inside a cave where no wind can reach. But no air remains either. The first sign of madness is usually talking to the dark. Some do it softly, like prayer. Others do it with laughter that sounds almost joyful. The voice becomes a companion, the only one that listens without cruelty. The walls answer. Of course, they always do. Every word returns to its sender, echoing slightly warped, slightly delayed, until it feels like conversation. The dungeon gives you back your own voice, changed just enough to sound like someone else's. There are stories of prisoners who befriended the echoes. A monk held beneath the monastery of Cluny claimed that he had spoken every night with an angel who lived behind the wall. When he was released years later, he refused to leave the cell, insisting that the angel would be alone. Another, a thief in Prague, scratched faces into the stone and whispered to them as if they were his family. When they found him dead, his hands were still resting against the carvings, as though trying to hold them. But madness in those places was not always horror. Sometimes it was mercy. It blurred the edges of pain. A fevered mind could make warmth out of memory, light out of sound. One chronicler wrote of a prisoner who swore that he saw dawn every morning, a soft glow seeping through the cracks in the wall, though the dungeon had none. He said it kept him alive. When they opened his cell after he died, they found no window, no candle, only a patch of damp stone that caught the torchlight just right. The dream of light was common. Every prisoner imagined it. The slow opening of a door, the scent of air that hadn't been breathed before, the taste of snow or rain. Some claimed they could see it in sleep, others said they could hear it. The muffled hum of life above, horses moving, bells ringing, laughter carried by wind. Whether those sounds were real or imagined didn't matter. They were a way out, not through the body, but through the mind. Hope, in the end, became a kind of madness too. It wasn't logical or linear. It didn't say I will live. It said only I will imagine living. And that was enough. For some, that imagination turned sacred. They began to speak of visions of Christ walking barefoot across the stones, of saints sitting beside them, of candles burning where there were none. To outsiders, these were delusions. To the prisoners, they were visitations. The mind, pushed beyond reason, found its own way to touch the divine. Yet for others, the same darkness birthed despair. Some grew silent and never spoke again, not out of choice, but because words lost meaning. Others laughed without stopping, a dry, empty laughter that made even the guards uneasy. A few simply walked into the corner of the cell, faced the wall, and stayed there for days, as if trying to step through the stone. It was in this half-world between hope and madness that most prisoners spent their last days. Their bodies decayed, their minds wandered, but somewhere inside them, a small fragment remained untouched. Call it soul, memory, or simply stubbornness. It refused to die before the body did, and in that fragment they carried the dream of light, not the sun itself, but the idea of it. When they closed their eyes, they imagined warmth, a single beam, soft and golden, spilling through the darkness, falling upon their faces. It didn't matter that it wasn't real. The body shivered, but the mind believed, and sometimes in that final belief, death became gentle, not a fall into nothingness, but a step into the light they had dreamt of for so long. When the guards found them, they often noted that the dead looked peaceful, mouths half open, eyes slightly lifted, as if watching something that no one else could see. Perhaps they were. Perhaps in those final moments the dungeon itself relented, allowing them to glimpse the thing they had imagined every night, a door opening, a wind moving, a light that did not hurt the eyes. And so it ended as it had begun, with breath visible in the cold, with silence where sound had lived, with stone that outlasted everything. But somewhere, in the thin air above the earth, the echo of their hope remained, faint, persistent, almost holy. He was always there, the man with the keys. You never saw his face clearly, only the glint of metal at his waist, and the sound of the ring clinking softly as he moved through the corridors. His footsteps were measured, deliberate, never hurried. He did not run, he did not whisper. He simply existed, the boundary between freedom and stone, between breath and burial. The jailer was not a monster, not always. Most were just men, tired, poor, loyal to lords who never remembered their names. They woke before dawn, descended into the cold with torches that hissed in the damp air, and began the same rituals every day. Count the living, remove the dead, replace the straw, lock the doors again. The dungeon's rhythm became their heartbeat, steady and merciless. At first they recoiled like anyone else. The stench, the coughing, the sight of bodies half-eaten by sickness, it all turned their stomachs. But disgust is a luxury, and like all luxuries, it fades with repetition. Within months, the horror dulled into routine. The key turned, the door opened, a bowl of gruel slid inside, and that was enough. The prisoners spoke less to them, and they spoke even less back. Compassion was dangerous. It slowed the hand. It made the nights too long. Yet sometimes, in the flicker of torchlight, a spark of something human survived. A guard might pause a moment longer by a cell, listening to the rasp of a dying man. He might leave a crust of bread where no one could see, or whisper a word that was not command but comfort. These gestures were small, and quickly buried under shame. The next day the same guard would curse, kick the bucket over, and pretend he hadn't cared at all, but the memory stayed. The jailers lived with ghosts too, not the dead, but the echoes of those they had watched die. They heard their voices in dreams, not as screams but as silences. Some drank themselves numb before descending the steps. Others prayed in chapels that smelled faintly of mildew, trying to wash their conscience clean. A few left their posts without permission, walking into the snow and never returning. In one record from the dungeons of Prague Castle, a guard confessed to a priest that he had begun to imagine the prisoners were the only real people in the world, that everyone above ground was a dream. They sleep, he said, and we wake them. The priest absolved him, but the words lingered, because maybe in some strange way he was right. The dungeon was not a place of sleep. It was a place between waking and dying. The key itself became a kind of curse. Every turn of it was an act of separation, of choosing who saw light and who didn't. The sound of it haunted the corridors. The scrape of iron against iron, that sharp click followed by silence. Some prisoners said that sound was worse than the whip. It meant the world had closed again, that no mercy was coming. And for the jailer it meant power and helplessness. He could open the doors but never the sentences. He could end a life with neglect or prolong it with a crust of bread. Each choice left a mark invisible to others but heavy to him. After years of service, his hands shook even when empty. Those who served long enough became part of the stone. Their voices took on the same hollow resonance as the corridors. Their faces lost softness, their eyes forgot sunlight. They became keepers not just of prisoners but of silence itself. When the dungeon groaned in the night, the stones expanding in the frost, they didn't flinch. They simply looked up, counted the echoes and returned to their post. Some died there too. Guards who never left their stations, who grew old in the cold. The last sound they heard was the same they had made all their lives, the soft final chime of keys slipping from their belt onto the floor, and the next man took them up. Without question, without ceremony, the chain continued, the door stayed closed. For the prisoners, the jailer was fate made human. For the jailer, the prisoners were the reflection he feared most, proof of what he might become if he faltered. In that narrow space between cruelty and pity, he learned to live without feeling, and when he dreamed, if he ever did, it was always the same dream, walking upward through the corridors, toward a light he could never quite reach, the keys still heavy at his side. It always came quietly, not as a scream or a struggle, but as a kind of surrender that began long before the body stopped breathing. The last night in a dungeon was never marked by ceremony. No one knew it was the last, not even the prisoner himself. The day ended as any other, a bowl of cold gruel, the sound of chains settling, the flicker of torchlight fading down the corridor. But something in the air always changed, almost imperceptibly. The damp felt heavier, the straw colder, the silence deeper. Even the rats grew still, as if waiting. The dying man lay curled, his back against the wall that had been his only companion for months, maybe years. His breath came slow, uneven, each exhale a faint cloud in the dark. The fever had long passed into calm, and though his body trembled, his face was peaceful. There was no strength left for prayer, no energy for fear. What he felt now was something simpler, a strange relief, as though the weight of cold and stone was finally loosening its grip. Sometimes the others noticed. They would glance toward him and then look away, pretending not to see. No one wanted to witness it too closely, as if death were contagious through the eyes. They whispered instead, half to him, half to themselves, little fragments of blessing, old words remembered from childhood. Sleep now. Tomorrow will be better. The lies were gentle, almost tender. The jailer would not come until dawn. He had learned long ago that the night could finish its work without help, so the prisoner was left alone. In the company of breath and stone, somewhere above the castle creaked under the wind. Somewhere far away, a bell might have been ringing for matins. But down here time had no bells, no hours, no end. And yet, for the one who was dying, there was a strange lightness. The cold no longer bit. It felt almost distant. The hunger that had gnawed for months dulled into a soft ache, like memory. The noise of chains and coughing faded until even his own breath sounded far away, like the ocean heard from deep underwater. In that muffled silence, something else began to stir. Not light, not warmth, but a feeling that might have been peace. He thought of things he hadn't in years. The smell of bread baking in the morning, the sound of rain on a roof, the way sunlight looked when it passed through leaves. They came not as sharp images, but as warmth in the chest, as if his mind were trying to rebuild a world it barely remembered. Perhaps that was mercy, that the last thoughts of the condemned were often the gentlest ones. Historians rarely write about these moments. Deaths in prison are recorded as numbers, not stories, but the stone remembers differently. It remembers the soft thud of a head against the wall as it grew too heavy to hold. It remembers the final exhale, long, trembling, almost like a sigh of relief. It remembers the silence that followed, a silence thicker than darkness, stretching for hours before footsteps returned. When the jailer came at dawn, he saw the body and said nothing. He had seen too many to speak. He touched the wrist, felt the cold, then took the keys from his belt. The chain opened with a sound softer than it had ever made before, as though even the iron understood. The man was free now, in the only way the dungeon allowed. They carried him out into the courtyard, where frost covered the stones. The first light of morning fell across his face. For a brief moment it looked as though he were still breathing, as though that thin, pale light had reached him too late but still wanted to try. And in that instant the difference between prisoner and sky, between darkness and dawn, seemed almost small. The body was buried in silence beyond the castle walls, in a shallow pit without name or marker. But the air around that place changed for a while. The other prisoners said they could feel it, a faint warmth that lingered for a few days before fading back into the cold. Maybe it was the imagination of men who needed to believe in something, or maybe for once the dungeon had exhaled. And though no record ever marked his passing, his absence became its own presence. One less breath in the dark, one less sound among the chains. The cell stood empty, but it was not truly silent. In the hush that followed, even the stones seemed to listen, and if you could have stood there just then, you might have sworn that somewhere deep in that frozen air you heard it, the faintest sound of release, like the echo of a key turning one final time. Centuries have passed, but the stones still stand. The castles that once roared with the sounds of chains and cries now sit in silence, their towers broken, their halls open to the wind. Moss grows where guards once walked. Ivy drapes the walls like shrouds. Tourists arrive in daylight with cameras and warm jackets, tracing the outlines of cells where men once froze to death, their laughter echoing where once there were prayers and curses. The air feels different inside those chambers. Guides talk softly, as if even now the place demands reverence. Their words? This was the dungeon. This was the torture room, hang in the air like spells. Visitors lean in, curious, half afraid to touch the walls. Some swear they feel a chill that doesn't belong to the weather. Others say it's only imagination, but imagination is how the dead survive. Archaeologists have found fragments. A rusted shackle, a wooden peg blackened by time, bits of straw compressed into stone like fossils of suffering. In some corners, faint carvings still mark the limestone, initials, crosses, a crude figure of a sun. They are small, almost invisible, yet they speak louder than any chronicle. Each mark is a whisper, a reminder that someone lived, hoped, endured. The walls have become a kind of scripture, written not in ink but in fingernails and desperation. Historians measure these prisons in facts, how thick the walls were, how deep the chambers went, how many men they could hold, but numbers cannot contain the sound of breath in darkness. The documents speak of justice, of law, of order, but the stone remembers something else, the rhythm of coughing, the drip of water, the heartbeat of the condemned. Sometimes when the sun sets and the tourists leave, the castles return to their true selves. The wind moves through the corridors like a ghostly procession, carrying faint echoes, a cough, a chain, a sigh. It's nothing more than wind against hollow rock, and yet it feels like memory. Those who work in such ruins long enough stop questioning it. They leave an extra torch lit, not out of fear, but respect. In some places they say that nothing grows where the dungeons once were. Grass turns yellow, roots twist away from the soil. Superstition, perhaps. Or perhaps the earth itself remembers too much. For centuries, rainwater has carried traces of ash, bone, and sorrow into the ground. The land keeps secrets as well as stone does. And yet, for all its darkness, there is beauty here, a kind of sacred endurance. These ruins have become places of learning, of empathy. Children walk where prisoners once lay, and though they shiver at the cold, they leave changed. The past breathes through them for a moment, reminding them that cruelty, neglect, and survival are all older than memory itself. The stone does not accuse, nor does it forgive. It simply endures. Every century adds a new layer, lichen, dust, silence, and still it stands, bearing the weight of all it has witnessed. The walls that once trapped warmth now absorb sunlight. The cells that once heard suffering now echo with footsteps of the curious and the living. And perhaps that is how history heals, not by forgetting, but by allowing the light to fall again where there was only dark. The prisoners are gone, the jailers are dust, but the breath of their nights lingers in the air, woven into the fabric of the ruins. If you stand very still inside one of those chambers, just long enough, you may feel it, the faint tremor beneath your feet, like a sigh deep in the stone. It isn't fear, it isn't ghostly, it's simply memory too heavy to vanish. The castles that once froze men to death now sleep beneath the sun, but the cold they held remains in spirit, an invisible frost, eternal and gentle, reminding us that every comfort we know today was built upon centuries of someone else's endurance. And in that quiet knowledge lies the final truth. Stone forgets slowly, but mercy, even after hundreds of winters, still leaves a trace warm enough to find. The cold is gone now, the torches are out, the chains are quiet, and the breath that once fogged against the walls has long since vanished into the air. What remains is silence, not the silence of emptiness, but of completion, as if every sigh, every prayer, every heartbeat that ever echoed here has finally found its rest. Time has softened what cruelty could not. The stones that once drank tears now wear moss and morning dew. The wind that once howled through the slits of iron bars now carries bird song. Even the dark itself feels different, no longer a punishment, but a memory of light waiting to return. If you listen closely, you might still hear it, the faint hum beneath the walls, the quiet rhythm of life that never truly stopped. It's the same sound the prisoners once heard between their breaths, that steady whisper that said, "Endure." The dungeon kept it. The centuries carried it. And now it speaks to us, gently through the cracks of time. Because the story of those nights was never just about pain. It was about persistence. About how even in the deepest cold, something inside the human soul refused to break. In the dark, men learned the smallest mercies. The warmth of a shared breath, the comfort of a voice, the courage of simply surviving until morning. And morning always came, slowly, stubbornly, sometimes unseen. But it came. The sun that now touches the castle walls is the same that once rose over the gallows and the graves, indifferent yet faithful, steady as forgiveness. So when you close your eyes tonight and you imagine the cold stones, the dripping water, the distant echo of chains, remember this. They are gone, but you are warm. They were forgotten, but you remember. And in remembering, you give their silence meaning again. Every ruin holds a lesson. Every echo carries a name. And somewhere beyond the frost, beyond the centuries, beyond all the locked doors, the night finally ends.